The precise click of the coffee maker at 5 a.m. was Cole Grant's first anchor in the day, a small, reliable truth in a world he found largely chaotic. The aroma, rich and dark, curled through his small apartment, chasing away the lingering chill of dawn. He moved with a practiced economy, each gesture a silent ritual, the careful pour of boiling water over oats, the placement of a well-worn leather-bound journal on the polished pine table. He ate in silence, the only sounds the rustle of turning pages and the distant cry of gulls, a constant, mournful backdrop to his coastal town existence. Interaction was a variable he preferred to minimize. The company of forgotten words, etched onto brittle parchment, offered a far more predictable solace. My sanctuary awaited within the hushed solemnity of the university archives. A vast, echoing warehouse, its shelves rose like ancient, forgotten forests, laden with the detritus of centuries. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the high, grime-streaked windows, illuminating a world suspended in amber. The air hung thick with the scent of aging paper, dry ink, and a faint, metallic tang I'd never quite identified. It was a perfume of time, potent and intoxicating to me. My role, university archivist, was a title I wore with quiet pride, a guardian of the obscure, the overlooked. My days were a methodical rhythm of cataloging, preserving, and cross-referencing, a meticulous dance with the past. Officially, I was organizing the newly acquired maritime collection, journals of long-dead captains, brittle charts detailing forgotten trade routes, manifests for ghost ships. But beneath the veneer of my assigned tasks, a deeper current ran, a private river of obsession. For years, I had been compiling my own index, a cross-cultural lexicon of anomalies, recurring symbols, peculiar phrases, descriptions of an inexplicable resonant hum or a specific, unnerving form of detachment described in disparate historical accounts. My colleagues, the few I interacted with, dismissed such pursuits as academic eccentricity, a harmless indulgence. They did not see the threads I was painstakingly weaving. Today, the threads began to tighten. I was deep within a collection of 18th-century nautical logs, their leather bindings cracked, their pages foxed with age. Most entries were prosaic accounts of weather, cargo, and crew. But in the margin of Captain Elias Thorne's journal, dated 1782, a crude drawing caught my eye, an angular, looping sigil, etched with a blunt pencil. I had seen that very sigil before. Silent passage through the southern seas, an affliction marked by a deep, internal resonance, a hum felt more than heard. A resonance. A hum. The air in the archives, usually a comfort, now felt heavy, charged with a nascent, almost electrical tension. My breath hitched, a sudden, unfamiliar tightness in my chest. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a living enigma, pressing against the very edges of my understanding. The meticulous order of my world, the carefully constructed walls of logic and reason, felt suddenly brittle. I needed to think, to process this new, disturbing convergence of evidence away from the silent, watchful shelves. I found myself, as I often did when the weight of the archives became too profound, walking the desolate stretch of coastline near my apartment. The wind, sharp with salt and brine, whipped around me, carrying the ceaseless roar of the ocean. Inside, the light diminished, swallowed by the ancient rock. The rhythmic crash of waves against the cavern walls amplified into a booming, resonant thunder, a sound that vibrated in my bones. I walked deeper, my footsteps echoing, until the entrance was a mere sliver of gray light behind me. I closed my eyes, listening, truly listening. Was it merely the sea, churning in its eternal cycle? Or was there something else, a deeper vibration, a sustained, almost imperceptible hum that resonated not just in the air, but within the very chambers of my skull? The captain's words, the Icelandic saga, the pamphlet, they all coalesced into a single, terrifying chord. I felt less alone than ever before, and terrifyingly, utterly insignificant. He moved with a practiced economy, each gesture a silent testament to his meticulous nature. My work was my sanctuary, the archives a quiet refuge from the imprecise clamor of existence. Today, the initial task was a medieval manuscript, bound in sun-faded pigskin, its vellum pages brittle as autumn leaves. I handled it with a reverence born of deep respect for forgotten voices. The script, a crabbed Latin, spoke of monastic anxieties, of pestilence and divine wrath. My magnifying glass glided across the faded ink, tracing the meticulous strokes of a long-dead scribe. Then, I found it. Tucked between a prayer for absolution and a marginal note on crop yields, was a drawing. Not an illumination, but a stark, unsettling diagram. Lines converged and diverged in ways that defied Euclidean geometry, angles that seemed to fold inward on themselves, creating a shape that was both present and absent, a visual paradox. It felt less like something drawn and more like something manifested. Below it, a single, scrawled word, murmurar. To hum. A shiver, faint but definite, traced its way down my spine. Such an anomaly in a religious text was peculiar, certainly. I made a mental note, filed it away as an interesting deviation, and moved on. The stack of documents awaiting my attention was formidable, a testament to the decades of neglect that had befallen this particular collection. Next was a colonial-era diary, its leather cover cracked and flaking, smelling faintly of salt and aged paper. The script here was a hurried English, detailing the harsh realities of early settlement on a rugged coastline. The author, a ship's carpenter turned reluctant homesteader, recounted struggles with the unforgiving land and the isolation of the New World. His entries grew increasingly erratic, his hand wavering, until, on a page describing a particularly desolate stretch of the shoreline, he sketched it. The same impossible sigil, crudely rendered but unmistakable. And beneath it, a frantic inscription, the humming returns, from the coastal caves, a sound not of this earth, a vibration in the very marrow of my bones. It calls, it calls. My breath caught in my throat. The first instance, a curiosity. The second, a coincidence of a most improbable kind. I leaned back, my chair groaning softly in the hushed archive. The air felt suddenly colder, the silence heavier. Two documents, centuries apart, disparate cultures, distinct languages, yet sharing the same unsettling symbol and the same fragmented description of an impossible sound. My academic curiosity sharpened into a focused intensity, a determined pursuit of the threads that bound these anomalies. I pushed aside the rest of the stack, my methodical approach momentarily abandoned. My fingers, usually so precise, fumbled slightly as I retrieved a slim folder marked Uncatalogued Anomalies, 19th Century. Inside were the private papers of an individual confined in a secluded institution for melancholy and peculiar delusions. The paper was thin. Watermarked, the handwriting a desperate, looping scrawl that often bled through the page. The resident, a reclusive cartographer, meticulously detailed their visions. They spoke of spaces that folded in on themselves, of colors that were not colors, and of a constant, low-frequency humming that permeated their very thoughts. And there it was again. Drawn over and over, sometimes with furious intensity, sometimes with a trembling hand, the non-Euclidean sigil. Each depiction was accompanied by a single, recurring phrase, the harmony of discord, it breathes the air of nowhere. The air grew thick, not with dust, but with an unseen pressure. 3 documents. Spanning nearly 500 years, across continents, penned by individuals who could never have known one another, yet each bore the same impossible sigil and referenced the same unearthly humming. And twice, the coastal caves were mentioned, not as a geographical landmark, but as a source, a conduit. This was not a coincidence. The familiar, comforting walls of the archive seemed to recede, replaced by a vast, indifferent emptiness. I felt a prickle on my skin, as if the air itself were vibrating, an imperceptible frequency building, just beyond the edge of hearing. My world, anchored by logic and documented fact, was beginning to hum. The phantom sound, a dull, resonant thrum, did not dissipate with the previous night. I dismissed the idea of an external source. The ventilation hummed its usual, predictable rhythm, the old building creaked with familiar complaints. No, this was something else, something that resonated not in the air, but within me, an echo of the impossibility I had unearthed. The 3 documents lay spread before me, stark against the polished oak, the medieval prayer book, its vellum pages brittle and fragrant, the colonial-era diary, ink faded to sepia on rag paper, and the private papers of the confined man, brittle sheets inscribed with a frantic, looping script. My fingers traced the recurring sigil on each, a motif of impossible geometry that seemed to shift subtly with the ambient light. The descriptions of the madness, a profound disorientation, a conviction of vast, indifferent presence, a terrifying clarity, mirrored each other with uncanny precision across centuries. And then, the sound. Each account mentioned a deep vibration, a song without melody, a whisper of the void. The same impossible sound. My initial methodical approach fractured under the weight of this convergence. The world outside my office walls blurred into irrelevance. Calls from a colleague, inquiries about overdue reports, emails from the department head, they became faint, distant echoes, easily ignored. My desk, once a monument to organization, transformed into a landscape of open books, scattered notes, and magnified fragments of ancient script. The coffee pot became my constant companion, its bitter steam of fog against the encroaching fatigue. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light outside my window. I worked with a frantic intensity, cross-referencing every symbol, every peculiar turn of phrase. I taught myself rudimentary Old Norse and a dialect of colonial Dutch, driven by the conviction that some nuance, some hidden key, lay buried in the original text. My eyes burned, but I could not look away. The sigil seemed to burn itself into my retina, reappearing in the patterns of the wood grain, in the condensation on my water glass. Sleep offered no respite. My nights became a succession of vivid, unsettling dreams. I would drift into a state of semi-consciousness, only to be plunged into a landscape of impossible scale. I remember the sensation of falling, not through air, but through immense, silent water, the pressure building until my chest ached. Then, the vision, colossal, slick rock faces, carved by eons of wind and tide, twisting into shapes that defied natural formation. These were the coastal caves, I knew, though I had never seen them. They stretched on, a labyrinth of shadowed grottos and echoing chambers, their openings like gaping mouths into an unknowable darkness. And always, within the dream, that low, resonant hum, amplified, a vibration that threatened to shatter the very fabric of my being. I would wake with a gasp, the taste of brine on my tongue, the hum still lingering, a phantom limb of sound. It was no longer confined to the quiet of my office. It followed me to the small kitchen where I made instant noodles, a deep, persistent vibration in the floorboards. It was in the distant rumble of city traffic, subtly altering its cadence. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it merely shifted, becoming an internal tremor, a resonance deep within my bones. I walked the perimeter of my small apartment, tapping walls, listening at ventilation shafts, convinced there must be a source, a faulty appliance, a construction project nearby. But there was nothing. Only the hum, a constant. Low-frequency presence, an uninvited tenant in the chambers of my skull. The more I tried to push it away, the more insistent it became, weaving itself into my thoughts, a counterpoint to the endless deciphering. It was a maddening, insidious presence, yet it also felt instructive. As if the hum itself was part of the pattern, a key to unlock the true meaning of the sigils and the descriptions of madness. My focus narrowed further, my determination hardening into a brittle, desperate resolve. I sat hunched over the latest acquisition, a collection of brittle, vellum-bound journals from a forgotten monastic order. Their script, a dense, spidery Latin, spoke of esoteric rituals and celestial observations. As my gaze traced the faded ink, the humming swelled. It seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very pages themselves, a low, resonant drone rising from the aged parchment. I pressed my ear closer, a foolish, desperate act, and felt the faint tremor against my skin, a pulse within the paper. The scent of dust in ancient ink, usually a comfort, now carried a faint, acrid undertone, like ozone before a storm. Each turn of a page seemed to amplify the sound, a crescendo of unseen vibrations. I pushed the journals away, a sudden, irrational revulsion washing over me. I clenched my jaw, trying to force it away, but it was inside me now, a parasitic echo. I stood, needing to escape the oppressive weight of the documents. My eyes, weary from hours of deciphering cryptic symbols, drifted to the wall. The plaster, cracked with the passage of decades, had always been a familiar landscape of imperfections. But now, in the intricate network of hairline fissures, I saw it. The sigil. The central loop, the radiating lines, the impossible angles, it was there, undeniable, a silent scream frozen in gypsum. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, then looked again. The sigil remained, mocking my sanity. I turned away sharply, my breath catching in my throat. My gaze fell upon the polished surface of my mahogany desk. The rich grain, usually a soothing swirl of amber and umber, now seemed to writhe. Within its whirls and knots, the sigil emerged again, less distinct this time, but undeniably present, a phantom scar on the wood's surface. My hand reached out, tracing the pattern, feeling only the smooth, cool wood, yet my mind insisted on the raised, alien texture of the symbol. Was I losing my grip? My meticulous mind, trained to observe and categorize, rebelled against this subjective invasion. I drove until the city lights thinned into a scattering of distant beacons, following the winding coastal road. The salt tang of the ocean promised clarity, a brutal, cleansing wind. I found myself at the entrance to the coastal caves, a place I had visited as a child, its vast, echoing chambers always a source of awe. The air inside was thick with the scent of brine and damp rock, a stark contrast to the musty confines of my office. Here, I thought, reality would assert itself. Here, the world was raw, indifferent stone and water, immutable. But even here, it found me. My light played across the rough, pockmarked walls. The ancient erosion, sculpted by centuries of relentless waves, had carved intricate patterns into the rock face. And there, in the swirling eddies of calcified sediment, in the jagged lines where fissures met, the sigil pulsed into view. Each time my light swept past, the sigil seemed to briefly sharpen, then blur, only to reappear with unnerving persistence in another patch of stone and the humming. It had followed me. Here, in the cavern's depths, it deepened, a low, subterranean rumble that vibrated through the very ground beneath my feet. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, for a way to dismiss this, to categorize it as fatigue, as hallucination. I was trapped, not by walls, but by a reality that was subtly, terrifyingly, shifting around me. The dull, resonant thrum, once a phantom echo, had solidified into a constant companion. It had driven me from the comforting weight of physical archives into the shimmering, chaotic depths of the digital. My fingers, usually stained with the dust of centuries, now danced across a backlit keyboard, chasing whispers through the labyrinthine pathways of the internet. I sought not polished histories, but the frayed edges of reality, the anomalies brushed aside, the data points too inconvenient to fit established narratives. My usual meticulousness morphed into a frantic, almost desperate hunt. I burrowed into obscure academic forums, delved into archived government records, the ones marked for deletion but never quite purged, and navigated the murky waters of historical societies' private databases. The screen became my window into a fractured past. Fragment by fragment, a terrifying mosaic began to form. I unearthed references to the sigil, not just within my initial findings, but scattered through millennia. Blurred images, low-resolution scans from archaeological digs, depicted it carved into prehistoric monoliths, etched into the clay tablets of forgotten Mesopotamian cities, or woven into the tapestries of medieval monastic orders. Each appearance was accompanied by cryptic warnings, often translated poorly, speaking of the great silence, the waking hum, or the understanding that shatters. The search for the sound and the associated madness proved even more unsettling. I found accounts of collective delusions sweeping through isolated communities, often preceded by unnatural frequencies or subterranean tremors. A 17th-century parish record spoke of an entire village near the Scottish coast succumbing to a shared melancholy, their voices replaced by a low, guttural chant before they simply vanished. An 11th-century Icelandic saga, digitized from a crumbling manuscript, described a settlement driven to self-mutilation after hearing the sea's true voice emanating from the cliffs. The details were always vague, always just out of reach, as if the very information resisted clear articulation. Files were corrupted, passages truncated, entire records deleted from servers long ago. Then the geographical coordinates started to appear, subtly, almost subliminally, embedded within the discarded data. Certain locations recurred with an alarming frequency, acting as focal points for these inexplicable events. Remote islands, desolate mountain ranges, and most disturbingly, stretches of rugged coastline dotted with coastal caves. These sea-carved grottos, I learned, were often the sites of ancient rites, forgotten cultic gatherings, or sudden, unexplained disappearances. A declassified naval report from the early 20th century, heavily redacted, hinted at a sonic anomaly detected near a cluster of sea caves off the Atlantic seaboard, followed by the complete mental breakdown of a research crew. Another, a local history blog post from a defunct website, recounted the legend of a fishing village whose inhabitants, centuries ago, entered a specific cave during a full moon and were never seen again, leaving behind only the singing stones. My mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, began to feel like a sieve. The thrum grew louder, no longer just a pressure, but a resonance within my own bones. It felt like recognition. The digital noise, the static of corrupted files, the blurred images, it all seemed to coalesce into a single, overwhelming message. I was not merely finding information, I was being shown it, guided by an unseen hand through the debris of human history. They weren't just random fanatics, they were groups who seemed to have anticipated this pattern, who had perhaps sought to understand or even communicate with whatever lay beneath the surface of reality. Their fragmented manifestos, translated from dead languages, spoke of the great listener, the unmaking chord, and the truth that unwrites the world. They believed the thrum was a gateway, a precursor to a wider understanding that would either elevate or annihilate. What if they weren't mad? What if they were simply the first to truly hear? My isolation deepened. My colleagues, if they even noticed my increasingly gaunt appearance and bloodshot eyes, simply left me to my obscure pursuits. They wouldn't understand the relentless current pulling me under, the tide of information threatening to drown me. I was alone with the fragments, the thrum, and the terrible, dawning realization that the patterns I sought were not just historical curiosities, but active, living forces. It was a frequency I felt more than heard, a constant vibration that had begun to remap the contours of my thoughts, shifting my meticulously ordered mind into a landscape of unsettling recognition. Each new document, each blurred image, each corrupted audio file I unearthed seemed to pulse with this same hidden current, drawing me deeper into its impossible logic. My latest discovery, buried beneath layers of academic censure and historical dismissal, pointed to a name, or rather, a former academic. A figure once brilliant, then ostracized, whose work, decades prior, had grazed the very edges of this same recurring pattern. He was a ghost in the annals of scholarship, whispered about in hushed tones, a cautionary tale for those who dared to chase shadows beyond the accepted light. My research led me not to an institution, but to the forgotten margins of the world, to a stretch of desolate coastline where the land surrendered itself to the sea. The journey was a blur of wind-whipped roads and an escalating sense of isolation. My vehicle, a familiar comfort, felt like a fragile shell against the encroaching wildness. Finally, the paved road dissolved into a track of compacted earth and loose shale, winding its way towards the relentless roar of the ocean. Ahead, where the cliffs met the churning gray water, lay the coastal caves. My destination was not within the caves themselves, but a crude, almost camouflaged dwelling built into the very face of the rock. It was a structure of salvaged timber and corrugated metal, weathered to the color of rust and despair, clinging precariously to the cliffside. A thin plume of smoke, barely visible against the bruised sky, curled from a makeshift chimney. No manicured path, no welcoming light, only the raw assertion of existence against the elements. I parked the car some distance away, the engine's dying cough swallowed by the wind. Reaching the crude door, I found it fashioned from heavy planks, scarred by time and bolted with a crude iron bar. There was no bell, no knocker. I waited, the salt spray misting my face, my breath catching in the sharp air. A single, gaunt-eyed, bloodshot and frantic, stared out at me. It was an old eye, etched with lines of weariness and a profound, animalistic fear. The face around it was a landscape of deep-set paranoia, framed by wild, unkempt hair. This was the former academic, I knew, his mind a fractured mirror of the very patterns I pursued. "My name is Cole Grant," I said, pitching my voice above the wind, trying to project calm I didn't entirely possess. "I've been researching certain patterns. Recurring symbols, sounds. I believe your work touched upon them. The eye remained fixed on me, unblinking, unreadable. There was no sound from within, no acknowledgement of my words, only the unwavering gaze. It was a gaze that had seen too much, understood too little, and paid too high a price. I found your old papers, I continued, desperate to bridge the chasm between us. The ones that were suppressed. The connections you drew, the implications. I'm seeing them too. The eye blinked then, slowly, deliberately. The hatch remained open, a narrow window into a life stripped bare. I sensed a stirring within, a shuffling sound, like dry leaves skittering across a floor. The thrum in my skull sharpened, a frantic hum of anticipation. Then, a thin, papery hand appeared at the hatch, pushing a folded scrap of parchment through the opening. The fingers were skeletal, trembling. I took the note, my own hand shaking slightly, and watched as the hatch slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. The bolt scraped back into place, sealing the former academic away once more. I unfolded the paper carefully. It was old, brittle, covered in cramped, spidery handwriting that seemed to weave and dance across the page. There were diagrams, symbols that mirrored the ones I'd found, scratched out and then obsessively redrawn. This was it, the external validation I had sought, a confirmation from a mind that had shattered under the weight of this very knowledge. The former academic had not spoken, but his message resonated deeper than any shouted declaration. I had found another who had seen, another who had heard. And he was broken. The implications were a suffocating weight. But I could not, would not, turn back. It began subtly, a shimmering distortion in my peripheral vision, like heat rising from an unseen flame. But soon, the sigil, the impossible symbol I had chased across centuries of crumbling parchment, began to bloom within that shimmer. It was there, unmistakably, superimposed upon my waking world. I sat at my desk, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating a stack of microfiche reels. I was attempting to categorize a newly acquired collection of maritime logs, a task once as comforting as the turning of a well-oiled gear. But the sigil pulsed, a faint violet black against the beige of the document box, its impossible angles twisting the very air around it. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, even pressed my palms hard against them until stars burst behind my eyelids. When I looked again, it was still there, a phantom tattoo on my retina. "Cole? Are you all right?" a voice drifted from the doorway. It was a junior archivist, holding a steaming mug. Her face, usually a study in earnest focus, seemed to ripple at the edges, her features elongating, then contracting, as if viewed through turbulent water. The mug in her hand stretched, becoming a grotesque chalice, its ceramic surface gleaming with an unnatural, oily sheen. "Yes," I managed, my voice a dry rasp. "Just a late night. My eyes are playing tricks." She frowned, her lips splitting into a smile that seemed too wide, too sharp, revealing teeth that were suddenly too numerous, too pointed. The mug in her hand began to vibrate, and the humming, that omnipresent, low-frequency thrum that had been a constant companion in my skull, intensified. It wasn't just in my head now, it resonated from the very floorboards, from the glass panes of the window, a deep, resonant chord that made my teeth ache. Her eyes, once a clear hazel, became pits of swirling darkness, reflecting the sigil that pulsed in my own vision. The words she spoke seemed to stretch, her consonants vibrating with the hum, coalescing into something else entirely. Not English. Not any language I recognized. It was a frantic, incomprehensible whisper, clawing at the edges of my understanding, yet undeniably meaningful. I pushed back from my desk, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, a sound that cut through the cacophony. The junior archivist's image flickered, then solidified back into her normal, concerned self. The mug was just a mug. Her smile was just a smile. But the sigil remained, a faint but persistent stain on the world. "I'm fine," I repeated, perhaps a little too sharply. "Just a headache. I think I'll take a walk. I needed air." My car became a refuge of sorts, its familiar hum a pale imitation of the one that now chased me. I drove, aimlessly at first, then with purpose, drawn by a strange, magnetic pull towards the coast. The sky was a bruised purple, and the waves crashed against the jagged rock formations with a relentless fury. I walked towards them, my boots crunching on the wet pebbles and shell fragments of the foreshore. Inside, the air was heavy, damp, and smelled of primordial decay. The crashing of the waves outside was muffled, distorted into a rhythmic pulse that echoed the thrumming in my skull. Here, in this subterranean space, the sigil blazed with an almost luminous intensity. I could trace its impossible geometry with my eyes, each line a pathway to an understanding I was not equipped to grasp. The humming in the caves was tremendous, vibrating through the very stones. They were everywhere, yet nowhere. It was my name, yet it wasn't. It was a sound that stretched the definition of language, a primordial chord struck on the instrument of my own consciousness. The sigil on the wall pulsed brighter, then seemed to detach itself, floating in the air before me. It spun slowly, growing, filling my entire field of vision. It was a deluge of alien concepts, of truths that tore at the fragile scaffolding of my human perception. My mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for a familiar thought, a known quantity. The world tilted. I was falling, not through space, but through layers of reality, each one peeling away like dry skin. My own body felt distant, a shell I had shed. I could hear myself scream, a thin, reedy sound, but it was not my scream. I was no longer Cole Grant, archivist. I was merely a lens, a membrane, stretched taut and tearing, through which something immense was attempting to gaze. The hum of the engine was a fragile shield against the world, a thin membrane separating me from the encroaching hum that was not sound, but a felt presence. My car, a metal shell hurtling through the night, became a vessel on a dark current, drawn by an invisible tide. The city lights receded in my rear-view mirror, replaced by the deepening indigo of the horizon, a bruised twilight that promised nothing but the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. The destination was not chosen by me, not truly. It was an instinct, a whisper in the deepest parts of my mind, a resonance with the very documents I carried in a worn satchel on the passenger seat. The faint, almost imperceptible tremor that had been a subtle undercurrent in my life now throbbed with a desperate urgency, a pull towards a specific point on this ancient, scarred coastline. Finally, the headlights cut through a thick veil of sea mist, revealing a jagged, black maw on the cliff face, the coastal caves. My breath plumed in the frigid air as I killed the engine, plunging the world into a sudden, profound quiet, broken only by the ocean's eternal dialogue with the stone. The satchel felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots like fragmented bone. A primal fear flared in my chest, a desperate urge to retreat, to turn back to the fragile sanity of my familiar world. But it was overshadowed, consumed, by the magnetic insistence that had guided me here. I was a puppet on an invisible string, my own will a mere suggestion against the force that now compelled me. The air was heavy with the smell of wet rock, salt, and something else, an ancient, mineral tang that spoke of eons. This was it. This was the place. With trembling fingers, I retrieved the documents. The pages, brittle and yellowed, seemed to pulse faintly in the weak light of my beam. The sigils, once mere curiosities, now felt like open wounds on the parchment, vibrating with a silent energy. My eyes, sharpened by a terrible focus, scanned the dense, interwoven scripts, the marginalia that had once seemed nonsensical, the diagrams that defied conventional geometry. It was there, buried in a fragmented text from a forgotten Iberian cult, cross-referenced with a series of Polynesian navigational charts that depicted not islands, but energetic convergences. The words, when finally deciphered, were not instructions for observation, but for engagement. They described not just the anomaly, but a method. A means to bridge the chasm. It wasn't a scientific formula, nor a mystical incantation in the traditional sense. It was a pattern, a sequence of focused thought, a specific vibrational frequency achieved through internal resonance, a deliberate attunement of one's own consciousness to a deeper, underlying hum. This was not about understanding it from a safe distance, it was about becoming a part of the mechanism, a willing aperture. My mind screamed at me to stop, to burn the documents, to flee this place and never look back. But the compulsion. It was a living thing. Within me now, a parasitic will that had taken root, entwining itself with my very nerve endings. My meticulous nature, my archivist's obsession, had been twisted, weaponized against me. The pursuit of knowledge had become a self-destructive hunger, an alien imperative. The documents outlined a specific sequence of internal focus, a mental posture, almost a ritualistic emptying of the self, followed by a deliberate, sustained attention to the subtle hum that already permeated my existence. It was a process of opening, of lowering the internal barriers. And the sigil. The recurring pattern that had haunted my research for months. It wasn't just a symbol of the entity. It was a key. A focal point. A mental anchor for the attunement. My hands, though still trembling, moved with an unnerving purpose. I found a flat, smooth stone in the alcove, worn smooth by eons of water. This was the precipice. The hum, always there, now intensified, growing from a distant vibration to a pervasive thrum that seemed to originate from within my own skull. I was ready to listen. I was ready to open. I was ready to break. The city lights, once a distant glow on the horizon, had long vanished, swallowed by a night that felt thicker, older, than any I had known. The hum of the engine, my fragile shield, now seemed to vibrate not just through the chassis but through my very bones, a low thrumming that was both within and without. My car, a metal shell hurtling through the dark, was a vessel on a current I could no longer deny, drawn by an invisible tide towards a destination whispered in forgotten texts. The asphalt ribbon dissolved into a gravel track, then a rutted path barely discernible in the gloom. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, a metallic tang, like distant static or the memory of lightning. Trees, gnarled and skeletal, clawed at the sky, their branches rattling like dry bones in the wind. Beyond them, the land opened up, a vast, featureless expanse that was the moor. It lay under a sky choked with bruised clouds, not a single star piercing the oppressive canvas. Was it the exhaustion, the relentless pursuit of the sigil, the sound, the madness, that was twisting my perception? Or was the moor itself a living entity, its ancient consciousness stirring as I intruded? It was the sound I had chased through centuries of fragmented documents, the sound that heralded the unraveling. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, beat a counter-rhythm to its slow, inexorable pulse. Finally, a silhouette against the bruised sky, a hulking, ruined form. The abandoned observatory. It stood like a cyclopean skeleton, its dome a gaping maw, its structure a testament to both human ambition and its inevitable decay. It carried with it the scent of salt and decay, a hint of the distant sea, yet also something else, a dry, mineral dust that seemed to cling to the very air. The ground was treacherous, boggy in places, the heather and gorse clawing at my trousers as I began the slow, arduous trek towards the observatory. The feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on my neck, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move across the desolate landscape. I drew my small flashlight, its beam a paltry spear against the encroaching gloom. Dust motes danced in the pale light, swirling like phantom snow. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp stone and forgotten dreams. A colossal telescope, once pointed at distant galaxies, now lay on its side, a fallen titan. I moved through the debris, my boots crunching on shards of glass and crumbling plaster. The hum here was amplified, resonating through the very stones, a deep bass note that vibrated in my chest. My eyes scanned the walls, the ruined consoles, searching for anything, any scrap of paper, any etching that might link this place to the pattern, to the sigil. Then, I saw it. Tucked away in an alcove, behind a collapsed section of wall, was a small, ornate wooden chest. It was old, water-stained, but surprisingly intact. My fingers trembled as I forced open the rusted latch. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, heavy brass disc. Its surface was intricately etched with the familiar sigil, the impossible pattern that had haunted my research. But beneath it, almost imperceptibly, were a series of finely inscribed coordinates, alongside a cryptic phrase, the deep resonance within the coastal caves. My breath caught. The coastal caves. The hum vibrated through the brass disc in my hand, a silent song of revelation. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a roadmap. The observatory, once a window to the stars, was merely a waypoint, a forgotten signpost pointing deeper into the earth, towards the churning, unseen currents of something far older, far more terrifying than any distant galaxy. My mind, already stretched thin, felt a new tear, a fresh fissure opening as the weight of this knowledge pressed down, drawing me inexorably towards the next precipice. The observatory dome loomed, a rusted iris against the bruised twilight sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and ancient metal, a mausoleum for forgotten starlight. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my soul, traced the cold brass disc, its low hum a constant, intimate vibration against my palm. The coastal caves, a promise of deeper terror, waited. But first, here, under the skeletal ribs of the great telescope, I had to open the door. I arranged the few items I had brought, for beeswax candles, their wicks trimmed short, placed at the cardinal points of a crudely drawn sigil on the floor. The sigil, copied meticulously from the oldest parchment, felt less like a symbol and more like a wound in reality, a gaping mouth. A small, polished obsidian shard, cool and dense, rested at the center, reflecting the faint glow of the city lights filtering through a grimy window. The hum from the brass disc intensified, a soundless pressure blooming behind my eyes. I lit the candles. The air grew heavy, static-charged. I knelt, placing the disc flat on the sigil, my hand still resting on its cool surface. Then, the world around me began to fray. The observatory walls, the brass telescope, the very floor beneath me, they rippled, not like water, but like a fabric pulled taut and then released, stretching into impossible angles. The candlelight, once a warm flicker, fractured into hues I had no names for, colors that were both solid and fluid, that existed outside the visible spectrum, burning with an internal light. They pulsed, a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry, each facet a shifting paradox. Squares became spheres, lines bent into non-Euclidean curves, and all of it churned with an accelerating, silent rhythm. My eyes strained, trying to grasp a single stable point, but there was none. Everything was in flux, a cosmic kaleidoscope of raw, unfiltered information. My mind, a meticulously catalogued library of facts and figures, began to buckle. The sigil on the floor swelled, expanding beyond the room, beyond the dome, becoming a gateway to an infinite expanse. I wasn't seeing a creature, no monstrous form or tentacled horror. What I witnessed was far more terrifying, an overwhelming consciousness. It wasn't looking at me, it simply was. A vast, indifferent awareness that permeated everything, a silent symphony of existence so immense it dwarfed the very concept of being. The pressure mounted, not physically, but internally, as if my skull were a fragile shell trying to contain an ocean. I felt myself stretched, pulled thin across an infinite canvas, then compressed into a singularity, a pinpoint of terrified understanding. The impossible colors swirled faster, coalescing into patterns that defied logic, alien geometries that resonated with a terrible, undeniable truth. My perception of up and down, inside and out, dissolved. I was adrift in a sea of pure, unadulterated thought, a thought that had no beginning or end, no purpose or malice, only an overwhelming, indifferent presence. It was the crushing weight of an infinite, uncaring consciousness. It didn't acknowledge me, didn't notice me. I was less than a speck, an irrelevant fluctuation in its boundless expanse. This entity didn't want to communicate, it simply existed, and its existence was enough to unravel the very threads of my sanity. My meticulous archives, my carefully constructed world of ordered facts, shattered into dust. There was no order, only this vast, indifferent truth. My body convulsed, a useless vessel against the torrent. I felt tears, hot and meaningless, stream down my face. The attunement wasn't a summoning, it was a revelation. My grip on the brass disc weakened, my fingers numb. The impossible colors pulsed, searing themselves onto the back of my eyelids. The observatory, the sigil, the candles, they were anchors I could no longer perceive, lost in the overwhelming tide. The coastal caves, I now understood, were not merely a destination, but perhaps the very mouth of this indifferent, infinite truth. And I, Cole Grant, was already halfway swallowed. The cold brass disc, its low, intimate vibration, had not ceased. I stumbled into my vehicle, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with a phantom sweat. The engine roared to life, a crude, violent sound that offered no solace, only another layer of noise to contend with. The road unwound before me, a ribbon of blacktop that seemed to writhe and undulate, mimicking the shifting patterns I now saw on the periphery of my vision. Every shadow held the nascent curve of the sigil, every streetlight hummed with the same insistent frequency that had become my new internal monologue. The world outside the car windows was a kaleidoscope of distorted normalcy. A billboard for a local diner seemed to ripple, the smiling faces of the patrons warping into grotesque masks that bore the faint, unmistakable mark on their foreheads. The rhythmic flash of a distant lighthouse pulsed, each beam a violent stroke that painted the sigil across the night sky, burning it onto my retina. I pressed a hand to my ear, a desperate, futile attempt to muffle the internal hum, but it only intensified, a low, resonant note that vibrated through my eardrum, into my brain, and down into my very teeth. I needed to make sense of it, to explain it away. It was fatigue, a hallucination brought on by stress, the culmination of too many sleepless nights spent poring over forbidden texts. Yes, that was it. A simple, rational explanation. I pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. Inside, a lone attendant, a young man with tired eyes, looked up as I approached the counter. The attendant tilted his head, a flicker of concern in his gaze. The pattern. It's everywhere. The sound. It's inside. It came from the observatory. The brass. It opens something. The words tangled in my throat, emerging as a disjointed string of non sequiturs. I gestured wildly, trying to describe the intricate curves, the impossible angles, the profound indifference of the entity I had glimpsed. The attendant's expression shifted from concern to something akin to polite bewilderment. He offered me a bottle of water, his voice calm, measured. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down." He didn't understand. How could he? The language of the cosmos was not meant for mortal ears, not meant for uninitiated minds. I stammered, trying again, focusing on the sensory overload. The vibration. It's a song. A frequency, and the mark. It's in the air. On the glass. Can't you see it? I pointed to the condensation on the cooler door, where the sigil now shimmered, impossibly distinct, a frost-kissed brand. The attendant only saw water droplets. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. This truth was mine alone, a burden too immense to share. I fled the gas station, the attendant's baffled gaze burning into my back. My mind raced, scrambling for a solution. The research. The documents, the photographs, the transcribed hums. If I destroyed them, perhaps I could sever the connection. Perhaps I could unsee what I had seen, unhear what was now irrevocably etched into my consciousness. I drove erratically, fueled by a desperate, illogical hope, towards the coast. The churning ocean, I reasoned, would be a good place to dispose of the evidence. Its vastness, its ancient rhythm, might somehow absorb the horror. I found myself at the edge of the land, where the wind tore at my clothes and the salty spray lashed my face. With trembling hands, I gathered every scrap of my work from the car, the binders overflowing with printouts, the meticulously catalogued photographs, the external hard drives containing years of meticulous, damning data. Inside the largest of the caves, the roar of the surf was muffled, replaced by the relentless slosh of water against ancient rock. One by one, I fed the documents to the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the ink dissolving into smoke. I smashed the hard drives against the cave wall, their plastic casings cracking, their internal mechanisms shattering. Each act of destruction was a desperate prayer, a plea for oblivion. But with every burning page, every splintered drive, the hum within me only grew louder, clearer. It appeared in the swirling smoke, in the intricate patterns of the rock, even in the flickering reflections on the surface of the tide pools. It wasn't external. It was internal. The knowledge wasn't contained in the research had merely been a key. The entity, the pattern, the hum, they were not things I had discovered, but things that had discovered me. They had found a conduit, and now, they were ingrained. Irrevocably. The fire died down, leaving only embers that pulsed with the same infernal glow as the sigil in my mind. I was no longer Cole Grant, archivist. I was a vessel, a living echo chamber for a truth too vast, too indifferent, for any human mind to bear. And the hum, a constant, intimate vibration, would never truly cease. The vibration. It's a song. A frequency, and the mark. It's in the air. On the glass. Can't you see it? My voice, thin and reedy, scraped against the damp air of the coastal caves. I pointed, my finger trembling, towards the shimmering distortion that only I seemed to perceive, a sigil of warped light hanging just beyond the reach of our torches' glow. The investigator, a stoic woman whose gaze held a weariness beyond her years, merely followed the trajectory of my arm, her eyes scanning the cavern wall, then returning to me, flat and unreadable. Icy condensation, coal. And the wind, it makes a mournful sound down here, doesn't it? Her words, carefully neutral, were a wall, impenetrable. She saw only the mundane, I saw the unraveling. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound isolation, traced its way down my spine. We stood deep within the grotto, the entrance a distant memory, swallowed by the winding passages. The air here was heavy with the brine of the ocean and the mineral tang of ancient rock, a smell that clung to the back of my throat like a forgotten dread. Waves crashed somewhere beyond the stone, a rhythmic pulse, a slow, insistent heartbeat that resonated with the frequency humming in my skull. Each echo was a hammer blow, driving deeper the understanding that had begun to bloom, poisonous and beautiful, within my mind. It wasn't just a sound, not just a mark. It was a language, yes, but not one to be deciphered with glyphs or phonemes. It was a state. A state of being that was reaching, probing, seeking. And I, in my arrogant pursuit of understanding, had not merely observed it, I had attracted it. My mind, meticulously cataloging the impossible patterns across centuries, had become attuned, a finely tuned instrument, vibrating in harmony with something immense and indifferent. My breath hitched. The realization struck me with the force of a tidal wave, pulling the ground from beneath my feet. This presence, this vast consciousness that had haunted the periphery of human history, wasn't merely a phenomenon to be studied. It was a signal. The distinction was crucial, horrifying. An observer merely watches, a receiver absorbs. And what it wished to transmit, what it sought to pour into the fragile vessel of my mind, was not knowledge in the human sense, but its own boundless, alien reality. The sigil, the sound, the madness, they were not symptoms of its presence, but components of the transmission. Each time I had traced the symbol, each time the frequency had resonated within me, I had been opening the channels, widening the aperture. My eyes snapped open. The investigator was still watching me, her expression unchanging. She saw a man on the edge, not a conduit on the precipice of obliteration. The thought was a sudden, icy clarity in the roaring chaos of my thoughts. I felt its pressure, a gentle, inexorable push, like the slow creep of a tide. It wasn't malicious, not angry, it was simply inevitable. It had found its way in, and now it desired full entry. To be fully received. To become one. The choice, when it presented itself, was not a question, but a stark, terrifying bifurcation of my very existence. On one side, the lure of succumbing. I could feel it, a strange, terrible peace that promised an end to the struggle, an end to the relentless questioning, to the gnawing fear. To open myself completely, to let the boundless signal wash over me, through me, transforming me. What would I become? Something more? Something less? The final piece of the cosmic puzzle, slotting into place within my own skull. On the other side, the desperate, almost suicidal, urge to sever the connection. To rip out the receiver. To sever it would mean to tear apart the very loom of my consciousness. It would be an act of self-annihilation, a desperate gamble that the fragments of Cole Grant could survive such an excision. The air in the cave grew thick, heavy with the unspoken decision. The waves outside seemed to roar louder, the echoes within more profound. The sigil, invisible to the investigator, pulsed with a subtle, internal light, urging me, pulling me. My determination, once a steady flame, flickered under the immense pressure. This was not a mystery to solve, but a war for my own mind. And I was the battlefield. I felt the entity's presence, not as a voice, but as a vast, silent intention, patiently awaiting my choice. The decision was mine, yes, but the weight of it threatened to crush me before I could even begin to choose. My voice, thin and reedy, scraped against the damp air of the coastal caves. I pointed, my finger trembling, towards the shimmering distortion that only I seemed to perceive, a sigil of warped light, pulsating with an unseen rhythm. The air itself felt thick, vibrating with the unsung chorus. "It's here," I rasped, my gaze fixed on the impossible geometry twisting above the salt-laced water. The pattern. It's opening. The detective, a solid figure against the gloom, stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "Cole, there's nothing but mist. And the water's rising." He motioned vaguely towards the incoming tide, a mundane threat in comparison to the existential horror that consumed my vision. The colleague beside him shifted, his eyes scanning the cavern, seeing only the rough-hewn rock and the spray-slicked floor. They heard the lapping waves, the distant gulls. I heard the song. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of my fractured thoughts. The entity wasn't just observing, it was entering. And I was the unwilling bridge. The centuries of collected data, the impossible sigils, the maddening frequencies, they weren't just academic curiosities. They were instructions. A ritual. I knew the patterns, the sequences, the specific resonant tones that called it forth. I had painstakingly pieced them together, not realizing I was assembling my own cage. But if I knew the summoning, could I not know the unsummoning? The reversal? The disruption? A frantic certainty seized me. The only way to close the gate was to corrupt its key. To twist the very knowledge I possessed into a discordant, agonizing cacophony that would repel, rather than invite. I had to become the static. In its transmission. The frequency, I whispered, turning from the shimmering sigil to face the detective, then the colleague, their faces blurring at the edges. It's a specific sequence. But if you invert it. I stumbled backwards, away from the water's edge, towards a dry patch of stone. My hands flew to my head, pressing against my temples as if to contain the burgeoning chaos within. It wasn't a melody, it was pure, indifferent information, pouring in, vast and incomprehensible. I began to speak, not in words, but in a guttural mimicry of the sound. A low, vibrating hum, a countertone to the entity's pervasive presence. My voice cracked, raw and unfamiliar. The detective took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm at his hip. The colleague's eyes widened in alarm. They couldn't hear the song, but they heard my grotesque attempt to replicate it, to break it. I focused on the sigil, still shimmering, growing brighter. It wasn't just visual anymore, it was textural, a rough, grating presence in my awareness. I forced my mind to invert the lines, to imagine them bending inwards where they should extend, to twist the angles into impossible acute forms. I pictured the harmony of the sound becoming dissonance, the smooth flow becoming jagged spikes. The caves seemed to shudder. Not from an earthquake, but from a profound, internal vibration that emanated from my own core. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, my muscles spasming. He reached for me, but his hand seemed to pass through a field of resistance, an invisible wall of psychic distortion. I ignored him, lost in the agonizing battle within. My identity, Cole Grant, archivist, human being, was under siege. The entity was pushing back, its indifference turning into a subtle, crushing force. It wasn't anger, it was the cosmic equivalent of a hand swatting a fly. My attempt to disrupt its pattern was an irritant, easily absorbed, easily overwritten. The song in my head wasn't just a frequency now, it was a million voices speaking at once, each one a different language of cosmic truth, none of them meant for human ears. My name, Cole, felt like a meaningless syllable, a relic of a forgotten past. I screamed, a sound torn from the deepest recesses of my being, a final protest against the erasure. I clawed my scalp, trying to tear out the invasive knowledge, to rip the sigil from my mind. My body convulsed. My name, my face, my history, all became fluid, like sand shifting in a relentless current. I was becoming everything, and therefore nothing. The agony was not physical, but existential, the slow, deliberate dismantling of my soul. I was almost gone. The song was no longer external, it was me. The song, a symphony of forgotten stars and the silent crush of eons, finally reached its crescendo within the hollow cathedral of my skull. I remember the rough stone of the coastal caves against my back, the spray of the indifferent ocean mist on my face. The sigil, not merely seen. Then, the world fractured. My own hands, once instruments of meticulous research, felt alien, distant. They clawed at my temples, not in an attempt to silence the clamor, but to hold the pieces of myself together, a futile gesture against an unraveling. The entity, vast and unknowable, pressed against the thin membrane of my consciousness, not with malice, but with an indifferent weight that threatened to crush the very concept of I. My knees buckled. I felt myself slipping, not into unconsciousness, but into something far deeper, a state where individual thought was a quaint, forgotten notion. A sudden, jarring shift. Rough hands, not gentle, but firm, gripped my shoulders. I felt the sharp bite of a cord around my wrists, then my ankles. The world outside the cosmic truth was intruding. Voices, distant and tinny, like echoes from a forgotten dream, reached me. He's unresponsive, one voice, deep and gravelly, observed. Another, sharper, cut through the din, get him out. Secure the area. And for God's sake, bag all those papers. My body, a mere shell, was lifted, jostled. I could feel the movement, the sway of a vehicle, but the landscape outside my internal maelstrom was a blur of meaningless shapes and colors. The sigil, however, remained, burned onto the inside of my eyelids, a brand of forbidden knowledge. This was an underground bunker, I realized, not with my reasoning mind, but with a primal, terrified instinct. My limbs felt heavy, weighted, and when I tried to move, a dull ache reminded me of the restraints on my wrists and ankles. They were not tight, but enough to prevent any sudden, frantic movements. Days bled into weeks. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept. Figures moved in and out of my peripheral vision, the silent attendant who brought a tray of bland food, the interrogator who sat across from me, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, asking questions I could not or would not answer. He spoke of coherence, of patterns, of delusions. He held up my research notes, my meticulously compiled evidence, the very papers that had led me to the precipice. His words were a dull drone against the vibrant, terrifying symphony still playing in my mind. Cole Grant, the interrogator, began one cycle, his voice low, almost sympathetic. "We've reviewed your work. The historical correlations, the linguistic analysis. It's impressive, in its own way. A truly monumental undertaking." He paused, flipping through a sheaf of my handwritten observations, the ones detailing the impossible recurrences, the sigil's appearance across cultures and epochs. "But these conclusions, this entity, this cosmic consciousness. You understand how this sounds, don't you?" I stared at him, my eyes, I imagined, wide and unblinking. How could I make him understand the sound that was not a sound, the presence that was not a presence, the truth that transcended all human language? My tongue felt thick, useless. The entity, vast and indifferent, pulsed behind my eyes. It wasn't trying to communicate in a human sense, it simply was, and I had glimpsed its being. My attempts to articulate this, when I had tried, had been met with a slow shake of the interrogator's head, a quiet sigh, and a renewed prescription for the viscous liquid they made me swallow. I remembered the feel of my desk, the scent of old paper, the thrill of a new discovery. Now, those memories were distant, fading echoes against the overwhelming reality of the entity's presence. I saw the interrogator gesturing to another figure, a specialist with a severe expression, who observed me through a pane of reinforced glass. They exchanged hushed words, their faces grim, their posture conveying a mixture of pity and professional detachment. I saw the specialist tap a finger against a printed copy of my final, frantic scribblings, the ones detailing the entity's attempt to breach, to manifest through the very fabric of human perception. "The patterns are too consistent," I managed to croak one day, my voice a rusty hinge. "The sigil. It's everywhere. They were trying to tell us. All of them. Across time." The interrogator leaned forward, a practiced concern etched on his face. "Who, Cole?" "The ones who saw too much. They tried to draw it, to sing it. Just like me." He nodded slowly, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. "Yes, Cole. Just like you." His words, though seemingly understanding, were a dismissal, a quiet burial. My work, my life's pursuit, was reduced to the ravings of a broken mind. I saw the analyst across the room, meticulously filing away my research, sealing it in heavy, unmarked envelopes. Not for further study, I knew, but for interment. My truth, my terrifying revelation, would be catalogued not as discovery, but as pathology. The world, I knew, remained oblivious. It spun on, a vibrant, bustling sphere of human concerns, petty triumphs, and fleeting sorrows. The sun rose and set, oblivious to the silent, immense presence that brushed against its reality. The indifferent stars wheeled in their ancient courses, their light carrying no warning. Humanity, in its magnificent, fragile ignorance, continued its dance on the edge of a chasm it could not perceive, while I. And the song, oh, the song never truly ended. It simply shifted, a constant hum beneath the surface of everything, waiting. My breath caught, a ragged gasp swallowed by the vast indifference of the sea-carved stone. I pressed the brittle parchment into the deepest crevice, a desperate testament against the encroaching silence. The salt-laced air, thick with the scent of brine and damp earth, clung to my skin, a cold embrace. This was my final archive, my last desperate act of transmission. Let them find it. Let them understand. Or let them, too, unravel. My work, my mind, was a conduit, and now, a warning. I felt the last threads of myself fray, dissipate, but the essence, the knowing, I poured into the ink, into the very fibers of the page. It would wait. And through it, I would see. I would hear. Years bled into centuries, or perhaps mere seasons. Time, like all else, had become a fluid, meaningless thing to me. My existence, now a faint echo tethered to the coastal caves, was a patient vigil. The world outside churned, ignorant of the delicate balance I had so irrevocably disturbed, the terrible truth I had glimpsed. Then, a disturbance. A new presence. I felt a subtle shift in the air currents, a faint tremor against the ancient rock. Footfalls, cautious and deliberate, echoed down the winding passages. A beam of focused light cut through the Stygian gloom, dancing across the damp walls, illuminating the slick, seaweed-draped surfaces. They moved with the familiar, meticulous precision of one accustomed to dusty archives and forgotten lore. They paused, their light lingering on the very crevice where I had left my offering. The researcher reached out, their gloved fingers tracing the rough texture of the rock before they spotted the edge of the folded parchment. With a gentle tug, they freed it. I felt its liberation, a faint exhalation of long-held breath. Under the focused beam, the researcher carefully unfolded the document. Their intake of breath was sharp, a tiny, audible gasp. I saw it through their eyes, felt their dawning apprehension. There, stark against the faded paper, was the sigil. Lines that defied Euclidean space, angles that twisted the mind, a knot of pure, indifferent consciousness. It was more than a drawing, it was an invitation, a key. Below the sigil, in my own hand, a single sentence, scrawled with a desperate urgency that transcended the years, it sees us. It waits. The researcher's fingers trembled slightly as they held the page. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Then, it began. A faint thrum, barely perceptible at first, a vibration against the inner ear, a pressure behind the eyes. It was the same sound, the same resonant frequency that had slowly, meticulously, unmade me. A low, persistent hum, like the distant turning of an impossibly vast machine, or the slow, deliberate pulse of a cosmic heart. The researcher's head tilted, a questioning frown creasing their brow. They heard it. They felt it. The horror was not in the words, but in the echo they now carried. The cycle had begun anew. I felt the burgeoning awareness, the subtle shift in the researcher's mind, the growing resonance within them. Another conduit. Another opening. My fate was sealed, my sanity long since scattered to the indifferent winds, but the threat, the vast, patient consciousness, merely waited. It had found another ear, another mind. And the hum, now a steady, pervasive throb, was its terrible, unwavering song.